Usually when we talk about a global crisis, there's this built-in expectation that it's a problem of scarcity.
Hmm.
Like, we imagine we simply do not have enough of something.
Right, yeah.
If you picture a famine, you imagine a drought, barren soil, just a physical absence of water and wheat. It's a very simple equation.
It's binary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's comforting in a grim sort of way because the problem is visible and the math makes sense. But then you step into the academic literature on global poverty and wealth, and suddenly that simple equation it shatters completely.
Yeah, it really does.
I want to start our discussion with a staggering contradiction that the data presents to us. Right now, today, the world produces an average of 2,826 calories per person every single day.
Which is, it's a massive surplus. The biological reality is that a healthy adult only really requires between 2,000 and maybe 2,500 calories a day. So we are outproducing our own biological needs on a global scale.
We are literally swimming in a surplus of food. And yet, the data also tells us that roughly 1 billion people across the globe remain chronically undernourished.
1 billion.
1 billion human beings. So if we are producing more than enough to feed everyone on Earth, if the physical resources actually exist, why does a 1 billion-person deficit in nutrition persist?
Right.
To answer that, we have to look past the physical resources and examine the invisible architecture of global wealth.
It's the ultimate structural paradox. We aren't failing to produce, we are failing to distribute. And that failure isn't an accident. It's the result of highly specific mechanics within international relations and the global political economy.
Unpacking those mechanics is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to the 10th session of our Diplomacy and International Relations Summer Series.
It's great to be here for the 10th one.
Yeah, time flies. Real quick before we jump in, we want to remind you to follow and subscribe. And if you want to support what we do, you can subscribe to our Patreon to help keep the show running.
Which also gets you access to extra sessions, plus our weekly and monthly briefings on Danish politics, which are, highly requested.
Definitely. The Patreon link is right there in the description. So, back to the mission for today. We are going to look at the machinery behind global poverty and wealth. We are relying entirely on expert academic literature today just to impartially report on what the sources say to understand how poverty is defined globally.
Right.
Why massive wealth gaps stubbornly refuse to close despite these eras of unprecedented economic growth and, the actual political choices driving international aid and trade.
And we're doing this because in our current, hyper-globalized era, poverty is no longer an isolated, distant phenomenon.
Right.
You might live in a wealthy suburb in North America or Northern Europe, but your domestic economic policies, the banking regulations your representatives vote for, and the consumer choices you make, they create immense ripples.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Exactly. Those ripples dictate the economic realities of people living thousands of miles away.
So we have to start with the moral foundation, I think. Before we can dissect the economics, we have to understand the philosophy of responsibility.
Right, the why should we care part.
Exactly. Because historically, if a country was struggling, the global consensus was essentially, that sounds like a you problem.
Yeah, historically, yes. For centuries, the international system operated on a highly rigid concept of state sovereignty.
Like the old Westphalian system.
Precisely. This dates all the way back to the Peace of Westphalia in the 1600s. The basic agreement was absolute control over your own territory. A state's borders were impenetrable to outside interference.
So it's a mutual agreement to mind your own business.
Essentially, yeah. It was primarily designed to stop European empires from endlessly fighting over religion. It meant, I rule my land, you rule yours, and what I do to my citizens is my concern alone.
But the source material notes that this definition of sovereignty is fundamentally shifting. It's no longer just a giant keep-out sign on the border.
Far from it. Modern global justice frameworks argue that sovereignty isn't just a shield against invasion, it comes with a prerequisite. It suggests that a state only holds legitimate sovereignty if it fulfills a fundamental responsibility to maintain the universal human rights of its citizens.
I'm trying to see how that works in practice, though. Like, if a state fails to feed its people or actively oppresses them, does the international community suddenly have a moral obligation to step in?
Right.
Because that sounds like a massive slippery slope toward constant intervention.
And that exact tension is the core of the academic debate. Our sources present two highly contrasting views on what wealthy nations actually owe to poorer nations. The first perspective comes from the philosopher Peter Singer, and it's commonly referred to as the rescue case.
Let's walk through Singer's argument, because it starts with a very um, visceral, personal analogy.
Yeah, it does. Singer asks you to imagine a scenario. You are walking through a park, and you happen to pass a shallow ornamental pond. You look over and see an infant drowning in the water. Now, you are wearing an expensive pair of shoes. You can easily wade into the shallow water and pull the child out.
Right.
It will require very little physical effort, and there is no risk to your own life, but you will absolutely ruin your expensive shoes. Singer poses the question, are you morally obligated to save that child?
I mean, I think 99% of people would say absolutely yes. The cost of the shoes is completely irrelevant compared to the value of a human life.
Exactly. The moral intuition is universal there. So Singer scales that logic up to the global level. He argues that wealthy states are the person walking through the park.
Ah, okay.
They possess immense wealth, advanced logistics, and surplus resources. Poorer states facing famine or extreme poverty are the drowning child.
So his ethical conclusion is that because wealthy states can help poorer states with relatively minimal effort, maybe just redirecting 1 or 2% of their gross domestic product, they must.
Right? It is a moral imperative based entirely on capacity.
I see the logic there, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. Singer's analogy assumes we are just innocent bystanders who happen to be walking past the pond.
Right.
It treats global poverty like a natural disaster, a hurricane or an earthquake that just happened out of nowhere, and we are simply being asked to be good Samaritans.
Which is the exact critique leveled by Thomas Pogge, the second academic perspective in our sources. Pogge argues that Singer's rescue case fundamentally misrepresents the reality of global politics. He introduces what he calls the coercive global order theory.
How does Pogge flip the script there?
Well, Pogge argues that global poverty isn't a tragic accident. It is not a natural state of affairs. He argues that wealthy states and the international institutions they built and control actively contribute to the persistence of global poverty.
Wait, actively?
Yes, actively. They design the international system, the trade rules, the loan structures, the property rights in a way that systematically extracts wealth from the developing world to enrich themselves.
So if we go back to Singer's pond analogy, Singer thinks we're just walking by and should help. But Pogge is arguing that the wealthy nations actually built the slippery slope, poured oil on it, and pushed the kid into the pond in the first place.
That is a perfect visualization of Pogge's argument, and that distinction completely changes the nature of the obligation.
Oh, so?
Because if Singer is right, foreign aid is a form of charity. You are a generous savior donating your surplus. But if Pogge is right, foreign aid isn't charity at all. It is compensation. It is a meager attempt to repair the ongoing harm that your own economic system is actively inflicting on the global poor.
Okay, I have to challenge Pogge's view here, just based on what the sources cover.
Yeah.
Is he seriously saying developing nations have absolutely no agency?
It's a fair question.
Like, if a local dictator in a developing country completely drains the national treasury to build himself a palace, is Pogge really going to blame the coercive global order for that country's poverty? Doesn't that remove all accountability from corrupt local leaders?
That is a very sharp critique, and it's a major point of debate in the literature. Pogge doesn't deny that local corruption exists, but he argues that the global order incentivizes and enables that corruption.
Give me an example of that.
Sure. International law currently grants any person who holds power in a country, even if they took it through a violent military coup, the legal right to borrow money in the country's name and to sell off its natural resources.
Oh, wow.
Pogge calls this the international borrowing privilege and the international resource privilege. So while the local dictator is pulling the trigger, Pogge argues it's the wealthy nations and their banks who are happily selling him the gun and buying the stolen copper from him.
That makes a lot of sense. The local corruption is just a symptom of a macro system that rewards exploitation.
Exactly.
Which transitions us perfectly into the actual mechanics of this system. Our sources identify 4 key structural conditions. They call them the 4 pillars of poverty that prevent populations from accessing wealth. Let's dig into the first pillar, the history of exploitation.
Yeah, this primarily deals with the lasting, compounding legacies of colonialism and slavery. And to understand the mechanics of this, we need to look past the moral outrage and examine the actual economic math. The text uses the history of South Africa as a prime example.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does a colonial policy from a century ago dictate a nation's GDP today?
Well, under British and Dutch colonial rule, and subsequently under the apartheid regime, indigenous Africans had their rights to own land, accumulate capital, and access quality education severely restricted by law.
Right.
The colonizing minority engineered the legal system to concentrate the nation's wealth, its gold, its diamonds, its arable farmland entirely into their own hands.
But apartheid was officially dismantled in 1994, right? Nelson Mandela was elected, legal equality was established.
Legal equality was established, yes, but economic reality is driven by compounding interest. If a specific demographic has been denied the ability to own land or build generational wealth for hundreds of years, passing a law that says everyone is equal now doesn't magically put capital into their bank accounts.
That makes sense.
Let's look at the mechanism of a modern economy. To start a business, you usually need a loan. To get a loan, you need collateral, like a house or land. If your family was legally barred from owning land for generations, you have no collateral.
So you cannot get the loan.
Exactly. You cannot get the loan, so you cannot start the business.
It's like playing a game of Monopoly, where one player gets to roll the dice and buy properties for 50 turns by themselves.
That's a great way to put it.
And then on turn 51, they let you join the game and say, okay, the rules apply equally to both of us now. May the best player win. You are mathematically guaranteed to lose because the board is already owned.
That is exactly how historical exploitation functions as a pillar of modern poverty. Even decades after the end of formal apartheid, severe wealth concentration in South Africa remains heavily skewed toward the white minority, simply because capital reproduces capital. The starting lines in the global economy are vastly unequal.
Okay, that brings us to the second pillar, war and political instability. Now, on the surface, this seems obvious. War is bad for the economy.
Right.
But I want to understand the exact mechanics of how conflict destroys the potential for wealth generation.
Sure. Peace is the fundamental prerequisite for a government to develop its human and natural resources. When a state is fractured by civil war or massive internal instability, several devastating economic mechanisms trigger immediately.
What's the first one?
The first is capital flight. Investors, both foreign and domestic, instantly pull their money out of the country to protect it. The second is the destruction of infrastructure, roads, bridges, power grids, which are the literal arteries of an economy.
I tend to think of a nation's economy like a household budget. If you are living in a house and the roof is constantly caving in and the windows are constantly breaking, which is essentially what a war zone is, you have to spend every single penny of your income just patching the roof and boarding the windows so you don't freeze to death.
Exactly.
You can never save money. You can never invest in a college fund for your kids. You can never start a home business. You are locked in a state of perpetual triage.
That household budget analogy scales up perfectly to the macroeconomic level. A government in a war zone cannot build a diversified economy. It cannot educate its workforce. And the data bears this out consistently. If you look at surveys measuring citizen quality of life, stable, peaceful nations regularly place at the very top.
The sources specifically mentioned Denmark and Switzerland here, right?
Yes, Denmark is a fantastic example. Nations like Denmark have built incredibly robust economies, not just because of good policy, though that matters, but because they have experienced prolonged, uninterrupted peace.
They don't have to spend all their money fixing the roofs.
Exactly. They've been able to invest their resources into social safety nets, education, and innovation, yielding a massive peace dividend. And this ties directly into how Denmark positions itself globally, which we'll get into. But contrast that directly with states like Syria or Somalia. In those regions, mass displacement and the physical destruction of infrastructure make long-term economic development literally impossible.
But the sources also make a really fascinating point here. It's not just the developing nations where the conflict happens that suffer economically. War drains wealthy nations, too.
Indeed, it does. The text highlights the United States' involvement in the global war on terror following the September 11th attacks. The estimates suggest the U.S. spent upwards of $3 trillion on overseas military operations over 2 decades.
$3 trillion. That is a number so large, it loses all meaning.
Right. To put it into an economic mechanism, $3 trillion is capital that was directed into manufacturing munitions, deploying troops, and maintaining overseas bases. It is capital that was not invested in domestic infrastructure, public health, or education. Wow.
And the source material points out the correlation. While that massive wealth was being deployed abroad for war, domestic inequality and relative poverty were measurably growing back at home.
So the mechanism of war actively redirects resources away from social development, regardless of whether you are a wealthy superpower or a developing state. It just hollows out the bottom of the society.
Correct. Which leads us to the third pillar, structural economic conditions. This connects directly back to Thomas Pogge's argument about the global order being rigged.
I really want to dig into this one because when we say structural economic conditions, it sounds incredibly dry and academic. What are we actually talking about here?
We are talking about the rules of the game. And those rules are set by massive global institutions, primarily the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Trade Organization.
But aren't these organizations supposed to be neutral arbiters? They sound like global referees. They are frequently presented as referees, but we have to look at how the referees are appointed. Voting power in institutions like the IMF is historically based on financial contributions. The more money a country puts into the fund, the more voting power it gets.
Wait, really? So the wealthy nations literally hold the majority of the votes. They are the referees, but they also own the stadium and play for one of the teams.
That's exactly it. And because of that power dynamic, they establish global trade rules that often heavily favor their own economies. Let's look at agricultural subsidies as a prime example of this structural condition. Wealthy nations, like the US or those in the European Union, heavily subsidize their own farmers. They give them billions of dollars in government money so they can produce crops very cheaply.
Okay, I understand subsidizing your own food supply for national security. But how does an American corn subsidy cause poverty in West Africa?
Here is the mechanism. Because the American farmer is subsidized, they can sell their corn on the global market at a price that is actually lower than the cost of producing it. Now, imagine a local farmer in West Africa trying to sell their corn in their own local market. Suddenly, a flood of ultra-cheap, subsidized American corn enters their country. The local farmer cannot compete with those prices. They go bankrupt. They lose their land. The developing nation loses its agricultural independence and becomes reliant on importing food from the wealthy nations.
That is incredibly insidious. The wealthy nation preaches free trade, but uses its vast wealth to distort the market and crush the developing world's agricultural sector.
Exactly. And if the developing nation tries to protect its farmers by putting a tariff tax on the incoming American corn, the WTO will often penalize them for violating free trade agreements. That is what we mean by structural economic conditions. The rules legally enforce a disadvantage.
It is a total light bulb moment for me. Okay, the fourth and final pillar is inequality, which the sources divide into absolute and relative poverty.
This distinction is crucial for understanding how poverty is measured. Absolute poverty is a metric of basic physical survival. The standard benchmark is often living on less than $2 a day. If you are in absolute poverty, say in a rural village in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you are engaged in a daily life-or-death struggle for caloric intake, clean water, and basic shelter.
It's the biological bottom line.
Yes. Relative poverty, however, is measured against the standard of living in a specific society. It measures social and economic exclusion.
I struggle a bit with the concept of relative poverty. Sometimes it feels like a luxury problem.
A lot of people feel that way.
Like if someone in a wealthy country has a refrigerator, a cell phone, and a television, but they fall below their country's median income line, are they really experiencing poverty?
That is a very common skepticism. To understand relative poverty, you have to look at the cost of participation in a given society. The source material uses the example of the United States, pointing out that millions of children live in poverty within one of the wealthiest nations on Earth.
How does that happen mechanically? If the GDP is so high, why are millions of children impoverished?
Because the cost of living, housing, healthcare, education is astronomically high. A family in the U.S. might statistically earn $50 a day, which makes them incredibly wealthy compared to the absolute poverty metric of $2 a day.
Right.
But if rent in their city costs $40 a day and commuting to work costs $5, they cannot afford nutritious food, they cannot afford a doctor's visit, and they live in constant precarity. Furthermore, they are priced out of the neighborhoods with good public schools.
So they are trapped. The sheer cost of existing in a wealthy society consumes their entire income, preventing any upward mobility. The inequality within the system reinforces their poverty just as effectively as an absolute lack of resources would.
Precisely. Whether absolute or relative, inequality acts as a structural barrier that locks populations out of the wealth generation cycle.
So we have mapped out the fortress of poverty. We have the history of exploitation, the devastation of war, the rigged rules of structural economics, and the trap of inequality. Now, I want to bring you in as our resident development policy expert, because I have some direct questions about what we actually do about this.
Fire away.
Because we constantly hear about massive global efforts, we hear about foreign aid drives opening up global trade. If we've been throwing billions of dollars at this problem for decades, why hasn't it worked? What actually reduces poverty versus what doesn't?
It's the billion-dollar question, literally. The academic literature categorizes these efforts into four main approaches. Let's start with the most visible one, official development assistance, commonly known as foreign aid.
How much money are we actually talking about here?
To give you a snapshot, the sources note that in 2014 alone, global foreign aid spending exceeded $135 billion.
$135 billion in a single year. That sounds like an overwhelming amount of resources.
Yeah.
It seems like it should be enough to eradicate absolute poverty entirely.
It sounds formidable, but the historical record of foreign aid is incredibly mixed. And the sources highlight three major mechanisms of failure. The first is the phenomenon of inappropriate aid. This is where the donors simply fail to understand the reality on the ground.
The source material has a specific example of this that completely blew my mind. It's almost tragically absurd.
The Gambia example.
Yeah. There was a case where donors in a wealthy nation rallied together and sent a massive shipment of advanced life-saving oxygen devices to a hospital in the Gambia.
Which, on paper, looks like a massive success for foreign aid. It's a tangible, high-tech solution being delivered to a vulnerable population.
Right. But what actually happened when the crates were opened? The medical staff realized that the machines were entirely useless. They operated on a completely different electrical voltage than the local power grid in the Gambia.
Yeah.
You couldn't even plug them into the wall. They just sat there gathering dust.
It is a textbook example of top-down problem solving. A donor committee in a wealthy capital city decides what a poorer country needs, procures it, and ships it without ever consulting the local engineers or medical staff. The aid is designed to make the donor feel good rather than to practically integrate into the local infrastructure.
It's the arrogance of we know best.
Exactly. And speaking of how wealthy nations position themselves, you asked earlier about Denmark.
Yes. How does a small, wealthy state like Denmark fit into this development aid picture? Do they just do the same top-down approach?
Well, Denmark is actually a really interesting case study in the literature. They're one of the few nations that consistently meets the UN target of spending at least 0.7% of their gross national income on development aid.
Oh, wow. So they actually hit the target.
They do. And their approach is generally recognized as being much more focused on human rights and poverty eradication, rather than just tying aid to their own geopolitical interests. They emphasize partnerships and try to align with the recipient country's own development plans, which is aimed exactly at avoiding that Gambia oxygen machine disaster.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's less about dumping equipment and more about capacity building.
Right. But even with good intentions, as bad as incompetence is, the sources point to a second, much darker mechanism of failure across global aid: outright corruption.
Yes. Let's talk about that. When massive influxes of foreign cash enter a country with weak institutions, particularly states recovering from conflict, that money is highly vulnerable to elite capture.
Yeah.
But how does that actually happen? People always vaguely say corruption. But how do you steal $1 billion of aid?
The sources cite the post-war reconstruction of Bosnia as a glaring example. Following the devastating conflict in the 1990s, the international community flooded Bosnia with aid money to rebuild. However, reports indicated that over $1 billion of this aid was effectively stolen by local political figures.
$1 billion, just gone.
Just gone. The mechanism is usually through phantom payrolls, rigged public procurement contracts, and shell companies.
How does the shell company thing work in this context?
Basically, the aid agency gives a grant to a local ministry to rebuild a road. The minister awards the contract to a construction company owned by his cousin. The company takes the money, builds half a mile of shoddy road, and pockets the rest. The intended vulnerable population sees almost zero benefit.
That is enraging. But we can't just blame local politicians, because the wealthy donor nations are often guilty of the third mechanism of failure, the political weaponization of aid.
This is perhaps the most destructive aspect of foreign aid historically. During the Cold War, the concept of development assistance was heavily distorted. The United States and the Soviet Union frequently used aid budgets as geopolitical bribes to prop up allied regimes, regardless of how authoritarian or corrupt those regimes were.
So the aid had nothing to do with building schools or hospitals. It was just a disguised military budget to secure loyalty.
Precisely. Look at the civil war in Angola, which raged from 1975 to 2002. The sources highlight how both superpower blocs funneled what was classified as aid into the country to fund opposing military factions.
So it was just a proxy war.
Exactly. This foreign funding literally fueled a decades-long proxy war. In this context, aid didn't alleviate poverty. It actively manufactured poverty by ensuring the conflict continued indefinitely.
So if foreign aid is plagued by incompetence, elite capture, and geopolitical weaponization, let's look at the second approach, trade and investment. The prevailing economic theory always says, don't just give them handouts, integrate them into the global market.
The primary engine for this is foreign direct investment, or FDI. The theory posits that if multinational corporations invest in developing nations, they will bring capital, technology, and jobs, stimulating long-term economic growth.
Okay, let's test that theory. If a major tech company from California decides to build a factory in Southeast Asia, how does that actually play out mechanically?
We have to look at what the multinational corporation is actually seeking. Developing nations often lack high-end physical infrastructure like ultra-reliable power grids and deep-water ports, and they often have workforces that haven't had access to advanced higher education.
Right.
Therefore, the foreign corporation is usually not looking to build a high-tech research and development lab. They are looking for one specific thing to increase their profit margins.
Cheap labor.
Exactly. Low-wage, low-skilled labor. They build a factory to assemble garments or solder circuit boards. Now, this does create local jobs, which is a marginal benefit. However, the mechanism of wealth extraction is severe. The factory workers are paid pennies on the dollar compared to Western workers. The actual profits generated by assembling those products are not reinvested into the local community. They are immediately repatriated, wired straight back to the corporate headquarters in California or London or Tokyo to pay dividends to wealthy shareholders.
It's like a massive corporate coffee chain moving into a struggling neighborhood. They might hire 10 local teenagers as baristas, which is fine, but the profits from the $6 lattes don't stay in the neighborhood to fund local businesses or schools.
Right.
The wealth is instantly vacuumed out of the community and sent to an offshore tax haven.
That is a highly accurate analogy. Foreign direct investment frequently traps developing nations in a cycle of low-value added manufacturing. They become sweatshops for the global north. The highest economic gains remain deeply concentrated in the wealthy nations, reinforcing the very structural inequality we outlined in the beginning.
This is starting to paint a very bleak picture. If foreign aid is flawed and foreign investment just extracts your cheap labor, how is a developing nation supposed to fund the massive infrastructure projects, the dams, the highways, the universities that they actually need to modernize?
Yeah.
If nobody is giving it to them and nobody is investing in it fairly, they have to borrow the money, right?
Which brings us to the third approach, money lending and the debt trap. And the central architect of this approach is the World Bank.
Let's do a quick history lesson. Where did the World Bank come from?
It was founded in 1944, right at the end of World War II, at the Bretton Woods Conference. Its original mandate was to lend money to help rebuild a devastated Europe. But as Europe recovered, the bank shifted its focus to lending money to developing nations in the global south for large-scale development projects.
On the surface, that sounds perfectly rational. A country wants to build a hydroelectric dam to power its industry. It doesn't have the cash up front. It takes out a massive loan from the World Bank, builds the dam, the economy grows, and it pays the loan back with the new tax revenue.
Yeah.
What is the fatal flaw in that mechanism?
There are two fatal flaws. The first is compounding interest, which makes the loans incredibly expensive over time. But the second and much more devastating flaw is the concept of conditionalities.
Stop right there. I want to fully understand this. What exactly is a conditionality?
A conditionality is a legally binding rule attached to the loan. The World Bank, heavily influenced by Western economic ideology, didn't just hand over the money. They essentially said, we will lend you these billions of dollars, but only if you agree to fundamentally restructure your entire domestic economy to match our theories.
Wow.
These packages of rules were called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
What kind of rules were they imposing?
The core philosophy was radical privatization and deregulation. The SAPs frequently demanded that developing nations slash their government budgets, eliminate subsidies for basic food staples, and privatize state-owned public services.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this correctly. To get a loan to try and build their economy, a poor country was literally forced to sell off its own public water supply or its electrical grid to a private, profit-seeking corporation.
Yes. The prevailing neoliberal theory at the World Bank was that governments are inherently inefficient and private markets are inherently efficient. Therefore, privatizing water would theoretically improve service.
But water isn't a luxury good. It's a biological necessity. How did that theory play out in reality?
The fallout was often catastrophic. Let's look at the mechanism. A government sells the municipal water system to a foreign private corporation. The corporation's primary legal duty is to generate a return on investment for its shareholders. To do that, they immediately raise the price of water.
And what happens to the absolute poorest citizens who are barely surviving on $2 a day?
They get priced out. They literally can no longer afford to turn on the tap. So they resort to pulling water from polluted rivers or unsafe wells. Waterborne diseases like cholera skyrocket. Public health collapses. The workforce becomes sick and unproductive. And the supposed economic efficiency of the private market results in a massive human and economic disaster.
Do the sources have specific data on the broader impact of these structural adjustment programs?
They do, and it is a damning indictment. The text points out that during the 1980s, when these conditionalities were most strictly enforced, the macro-level result was horrifying. Instead of growing, income per capita actually fell in 18 Latin American countries and 26 sub-Saharan African countries.
That's unbelievable.
Economists literally refer to this period as a lost decade for development.
They forced the medicine down their throats, and the medicine actively poisoned the patient.
And the tragic irony is that because the economy shrank, these nations couldn't generate the revenue to pay back the original World Bank loans. The compounding interest ballooned. Today, many developing nations are caught in a permanent debt trap. They are forced to spend massive portions of their annual national budget just servicing the interest on their international debt,
Leaving them absolutely nothing to spend on their own domestic education, healthcare, or infrastructure. They are permanently trapped on a treadmill, running at full speed just to pay interest to wealthy institutions in Washington, D.C., while their own children go without schools.
which logically forces us to examine the fourth and final approach to poverty reduction, the United Nations goals. As the failures of the debt trap and conditionality models became undeniable in the late 90s, the international community tried to coordinate a more humane, metric-driven response.
This resulted in the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, correct?
Yep. Yes. Launched in the year 2000, the MDGs were a set of 8 specific, measurable targets aimed at eradicating extreme poverty, improving maternal health, and achieving universal primary education by 2015.
Having specific measurable targets sounds like a vast improvement over vague ideological restructuring. But the sources highlight a massive fatal flaw in how the UN actually measured success.
This is a masterclass in how statistical data can create dangerous blind spots. The former executive director of UNICEF, Anthony Lake, offered a profound critique of the MDGs. He pointed out that the UN tracked progress by looking at national averages.
Okay, I want to understand why a national average is a bad metric. If the national average of literacy goes up, isn't that a win?
It is a win on paper, but it distorts the behavior of the government. Let's look at the mechanism. Imagine you are a government minister in a developing nation. The UN has promised you prestige and future funding if you increase your national average for child vaccinations by 10%.
Okay.
You have a limited budget. How do you get those numbers up as fast and as cheaply as possible?
Well, I would send all my medical teams to the dense urban centers, the capital city. The populations that are already relatively stable have access to roads and are easy to reach. I can vaccinate thousands of kids in a week.
Exactly. You pick the low-hanging fruit. But what about the nomadic tribes in the remote mountains? What about the ethnic minorities living in a conflict zone 300 miles from the capital?
Reaching them would require off-road vehicles, military escorts, complex logistics. It would cost 10 times as much to vaccinate one child there as it does in the capital city. So if my only goal is to boost the national average, I am economically incentivized to completely ignore the most vulnerable people in my country.
That is precisely the flaw Anthony Lake identified. By chasing national statistical averages, the MDG framework inadvertently encouraged governments to leave the deeply marginalized, hardest-to-reach communities completely behind. The averages looked great in UN reports, but the poorest of the poor saw no change whatsoever.
It's like a failing high school trying to boost its average test scores by hiring expensive tutors for the B students so they get A's, while entirely ignoring the failing students who are dropping out. The average goes up, but the core failure remains.
Recognizing this profound structural flaw, the UN transitioned to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, in 2015. The SDGs are fundamentally different. They are much more granular, and their core philosophy is to actively target the most marginalized communities first. They aim to address the root causes of systemic exclusion rather than just treating the statistical symptoms.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and zoom all the way out. We have systematically dismantled the mechanisms of foreign aid, global trade, international debt, and UN statistical goals.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But none of these approaches exist in a vacuum. They are all gears spinning within the massive, overarching engine of our modern world globalization.
Yes. Globalization is the grand theater where all of this plays out. The integration of technology, trade, and culture across borders. And the ultimate question the academic literature wrestles with is globalization the cure for global poverty, or is it the disease?
And as with everything we've discussed today, the answer is a terrifying paradox. Let's start with the positive metric, because we cannot ignore the raw data.
The positive metric is undeniably staggering. The integration of global markets, particularly the massive opening up of the Chinese and Indian economies to global trade over the last few decades, facilitated the greatest reduction in absolute poverty in human history.
What are the exact numbers on that?
In 1981, over 50% of the global population lived in extreme absolute poverty. Today, that number has dropped to roughly 10%.
That is hundreds of millions of human beings who are no longer starving to death because of the wealth generated by global interconnectedness. If you stop the analysis right there, globalization looks like an unmitigated triumph.
But you cannot stop the analysis there, because while globalization drastically reduced extreme, absolute poverty, it simultaneously triggered a massive systemic explosion of relative inequality.
The gap between the floor and the ceiling got wider than it has ever been.
Exactly. The extreme floor was raised slightly. People moved from starving to working in sweatshops, but the ceiling rocketed into the stratosphere. The vast, overwhelming majority of the wealth generated by this global trade was captured by an infinitesimally small elite at the very top.
The sources outline a fascinating cultural and economic debate about this. On one side, proponents of globalization pitch it as a beautiful hybridity.
Yes, the hybridity argument suggests that globalization is a mutual exchange. We share ideas, we share technology, we blend cultures, and a rising tide lifts all boats globally.
But the critique in the text is that it's not hybridity at all. It's just aggressive Americanization or Westernization wearing a friendly mask.
The critics argue that the rules of globalization are explicitly written by and primarily benefit Western multinational corporations. It's not an equal exchange of culture, it is the exportation of consumer capitalism. And this ties directly into the prevailing economic philosophy that has driven the global order since the 1970s, the neoliberal agenda.
We touched on neoliberalism when we talked about the World Bank forcing countries to privatize their water, but I want to fully understand the ideology behind it.
Neoliberalism is an economic doctrine that champions three main pillars: the aggressive deregulation of financial and corporate markets, the privatization of state-owned public services, and the absolute minimization of government intervention in the economy. The core belief is that the free market, if left completely unchecked, is the ultimate solver of all human problems.
And the primary political promise of neoliberalism was the concept of trickle-down economics, right?
Yes. The theory was that if you remove taxes and regulations on the wealthiest corporations and individuals, they will generate massive amounts of capital. And that wealth will eventually, naturally trickle down through the economy to the poorest citizens in the form of jobs and cheaper goods.
The source material brings in Joseph Stiglitz to address this. He's a Nobel laureate in economics and actually served as the chief economist for the World Bank. What is his verdict on the neoliberal promise?
Stiglitz offers a scathing, empirically backed critique. He points out that the foundational promise of trickle-down economics is a mathematical fiction. It simply does not happen. Decades of data show that when you deregulate markets and enrich at the top, the wealth does not trickle down, it pools at the top. The rich use their excess capital to buy assets, monopolize industries, and influence political systems to further protect their wealth. The inequality becomes structurally locked in.
Okay, I want to test Stiglitz's critique with a real-world case study. And the sources provide the perfect, horrifying example of how this neoliberal global machine actually operates when it breaks down. Let's walk step by step through the 2008 financial crisis.
The 2008 crisis is the ultimate demonstration of the globalization paradox. It perfectly illustrates how a hyper-connected world actually amplifies vulnerability for the poorest people.
Walk me through the mechanics of the domino effect. It started in the United States as a highly localized issue, right?
It started with the collapse of the subprime mortgage market in the U.S. Essentially, due to extreme neoliberal deregulation, American banks were allowed to give massive home loans to people who mathematically could not pay them back.
And when those people in, say, Florida or Nevada inevitably defaulted on their mortgages, the banks were holding billions of dollars of worthless paper.
Yes. But because global financial markets are so deeply intertwined, because European and Asian banks had bought complex financial products tied to those American mortgages, the localized housing crisis instantly triggered a massive systemic global banking freeze. Credit dried up worldwide. The global economy crashed.
Now, here's where we have to connect the dots. How does a banker in New York making a terrible bet on a mortgage in Florida end up devastating a developing nation in the global south?
Let's trace the exact path of the economic shockwave. When the global banking system froze, wealthy nations panicked. Their governments implemented brutal austerity measures. They tightened their belts and started hoarding capital to save their own domestic economies.
Which means they stopped sending money outward.
Exactly. Foreign direct investment, the capital that developing nations rely on to build factories and infrastructure, completely plummeted. Aid budgets were slashed because wealthy politicians argued, we can't send money abroad when our own citizens are losing their homes. Furthermore, global trade slowed to a crawl. Wealthy consumers stopped buying imported goods.
So, because American banks crashed the global economy, an American consumer stops buying clothes, which means the multinational corporation cancels its order from a factory in Bangladesh, which means the factory owner in Bangladesh fires 1,000 textile workers.
Yes, that is the exact mechanism. But it gets worse. When those textile workers lose their jobs, they have no social safety net, there is no unemployment insurance, and because the developing nation's currency often crashes during a global panic, the cost of imported basic food staples skyrockets.
So the worker loses their income on the exact same day that the price of bread doubles.
That is the stark, brutal reality of the system. The ultimate lesson of the 2008 crisis is that in a hyper-connected, neoliberal global economy, the poorest populations inevitably suffer the most severe, life-threatening consequences of economic shocks created entirely by the reckless behavior of the wealthiest nations. When Wall Street catches a cold, the developing world gets pneumonia, and they have no hospitals to treat it.
I am genuinely staggered by the scale of what we've unpacked today. We started with a simple question about a surplus of calories, and we've ended up mapping a global architecture of systemic inequality. We need to distill this massive amount of information down. I want to pull out the 3 most critical takeaways from everything we've discussed.
I believe the literature points us toward 3 undeniable conclusions.
Takeaway number 1 is the realization that poverty is structural, not incidental.
Yes. If you take nothing else away from this discussion, understand that global poverty persists not because we lack physical resources, but because of a complex, deliberately constructed web. It is the compounding legacy of historical exploitation, the devastation of ongoing political instability, and the rigged systemic inequality built deeply into the rules of global trade and finance. Poverty is not an accident of nature. It is a structural byproduct of the global order.
Takeaway number 2 focuses on the failure of our supposed solutions, the flaws of top-down approaches.
We have clearly seen that the political choices behind global aid, foreign investment, and international loans have frequently prioritized the interests of the wealthy donors. Whether it is weaponizing aid for Cold War geopolitics, extracting cheap labor through FBI, or using World Bank loans to force radical privatization, these top-down solutions have consistently ignored the actual ground-level needs of the most vulnerable people.
And takeaway number 3 is the ultimate double-edged sword, the globalization paradox.
We must hold 2 contradictory truths simultaneously. Global interconnectedness has successfully lifted hundreds of millions out of extreme, life-threatening absolute poverty. But it has concurrently entrenched massive relative inequality, concentrated unprecedented wealth at the very top, and made developing nations highly dangerously vulnerable to the economic mistakes of the wealthy world.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought to leave you with. We started this journey by picturing a physical contradiction. The fact that we produce an average of 2,826 calories per person, yet a billion people go hungry. It is the ultimate X-ray of a broken system where the vital resources simply are not flowing to where they are desperately needed.
Because the pathways are blocked by the structural inequalities we've spent this session detailing.
Exactly. So, if we accept the reality that our modern globalized world is now so deeply, inextricably interconnected that a reckless housing crisis in one wealthy country can literally starve investment and cost jobs in the developing world, how long can wealthy nations continue to operate under the illusion of isolation?
It's a great question.
How long can governments continue to define national security solely in terms of their own physical borders, their own militaries, and their own domestic stock markets? How long can they go on without realizing that the economic security of the world's most vulnerable people is actually a core foundational component of their own long-term stability? Because as we've seen clearly today, in a closed, interconnected loop, you cannot keep pushing the vulnerable into the pond without eventually drowning yourself.
It is a profound structural question, and one that the international community can no longer afford to ignore.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the mechanics of global wealth and poverty. We encourage you to follow the show, share this discussion with anyone who wants to understand the structures beneath the headlines. And if you found this session valuable, please rate the show 5 stars so we can continue bringing these critical academic insights to an even wider audience. Also, remember to check out our Patreon for those weekly and monthly Danish politics briefings.
We'll see you next time.
And join us next time, where we'll be tackling the complexities of protecting people and human security. See you then.